Hello and welcome to the CNO's latest webinar designed to assist staff and local unions in understanding the variety of government support measures resulting from the COVID-19 pandemic. Today we'll be discussing the Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy, and we'll also discuss several recent important changes to the program. My name is Meg Gingrich, and today I'm joined by Matthew O'Reilly and Guillaume Jacinto from the CNO Research Department. Before we begin, I'd like to say on behalf of all of us here at the CNO, I hope that everyone continues to hold up as best they can through these difficult times. Many of you were with us back in the early days of the pandemic after the government announced a host of measures designed to assist workers and employers with the pandemic's economic consequences. The CEWS, or the wage subsidy, was created in large part to provide a means for employers to continue to employ workers despite shutdowns or revenue losses. Through the wage subsidy program, employers who have experienced a revenue decline have been able to receive up to 75% subsidy for wages. The structure and the details of the wage subsidy have changed a few times since its inception. Most recently, earlier this fall, when it was modified and extended until 2021. We'll take you through those changes, provide information on how the wage subsidy has been used and by whom, and discuss some implications for collective bargaining. At the end of the formal presentation, we'll answer questions that have come in and then use any remaining time to open up the mics and take live questions. To ask a question or get on the speakers list, you can use the chat function or you can raise your hand and indicate that you'd like to ask a question. But for now, let's get to the formal presentation. So over to you, Matthew, who's going to start with an overview of the changes to the wage subsidy.
Great, thanks, Meg. So I'm going to review what the program is and the changes that were introduced over the months. First of all, the CEWS is a wage subsidy. The federal government will reimburse eligible employers for a portion of their payroll costs. So that's what the money's for, payroll. For most claim periods, the maximum subsidy is 75% of eligible remuneration up to $1,129, and 75% of $1,129 is $847. It gets a bit more complicated than that, but for most claim periods, the maximum an employer can get is $847 per week per employee. To be eligible, employers must demonstrate a decline in revenue, and the program is administered through the CRA. The way it works is that employers pay their workers up front and then apply to be reimbursed. And employers can apply after the fact. So for periods 1 to 5, that's from the beginning until the end of July. The last day to apply is January 31, 2021. And then for the other periods, it's about 6 months after the end of the claim period. There are several advantages to a wage subsidy. It is intended to keep workers in their jobs, so it supports employment. And by doing so, the wage subsidy keeps workers in employer-sponsored benefit plans. And it's argued it will be easier to restart the economy if companies don't have to rehire their workers. And finally, the amount of money workers are likely to receive is higher if they stay on their employer's payroll. So employers make claims for specific claim periods, and we have on the right here a list of all the claim periods. So these are up until the end of December 19th. So these are specific 4-week periods which begin on a Sunday. Because there have been several changes to the program, there are actually different sets of rules for different claim periods. So I'm going to talk about these changes as 3 distinct phases which relate to pieces of legislation. So the original plan, an expansion over the summer, and an extension in the fall. I will also note the changes announced in the fall economic statement, but not yet brought into effect. So the original plan, you might recall the first we heard about a wage subsidy was actually an announcement for a 10% subsidy only for small businesses. That was announced on Wednesday, March 18th. Well, by the next Wednesday, the CERB was announced, and 2 days later on Friday, March 27th, the CEWS was announced. The original rules were stricter than they are now. You had to demonstrate either a 15% decline in revenue in the first period or a 30% decline in periods 2 through 4. If you didn't meet those thresholds, you were not eligible. And the subsidy was for 75% of wages, up to a maximum of $847 per employee per week. And one sticking point was that a company was not able to claim the subsidy for employees it had laid off or had been unpaid for 14 days. That was a bit of a headache and required employers to rehire employees back to the date of layoff and pay them retroactively. That created situations where employees might have to pay back some CERB monies that they received while they were laid off. The original plan also incorporated the previously announced 10% subsidy. The wheels had already been set in motion on the 10% subsidy, so if you had claimed it, that amount was deducted from your total subsidy for these first 4 periods. The program was expanded considerably with Bill C-20. The announcements from the government came in May, but legislation only received royal assent on July 17th. The 2 big changes here is that an employer could receive a subsidy even if they didn't meet the 30% revenue decline threshold. In fact, the subsidy will be proportional to the decline in revenue. This sliding scale was accomplished by changing the structure of the subsidy. Now you have a base subsidy that's available to everyone and a top-up available for companies that experience a 50% or more decline in revenue. Bill C-20 also projected that the base rate would decline between periods 6 and 8, so that the maximum subsidy rate would only be 65% from period 8 on. And the actual subsidy rate for companies with less than 50% revenue decline would be less than that. But in order to not negatively affect applicants who had already been receiving the subsidy, there was a safe harbor rule for periods 5 and 6. So the new rules would not cause a decline in subsidy for those periods. Now, I'm not going to get into all the rules about calculating revenue relative to baseline periods, except to say that employers now have a few different options. They can compare a month to the same month last year or to an average of January and February 2020. There are also rules to prevent a subsidy from declining considerably from one period to the next. So Bill C-20 introduced some flexibility here. And a last thing on this Bill C-20 phase, with the statements the government made over the summer, especially with the decline in base rate from period to period, it really looked like the intention was to wind down the subsidy, maybe ending it in December, but not so fast. But in September, in the September throne speech, the government announced its intention to extend the wage subsidy until June of 2021. And this was followed with legislation, Bill C-9, in November. A big change here, not a change. The maximum subsidy rate for these periods would be 65% of wages, and that works out to $733 per week per employee. So about $100 less than the maximum subsidy was when it was at 75%. This had already been projected by the previous Bill C-20, but now there are no safe harbor rules. Another big change for us is that the subsidy rate for inactive employees is being aligned with EI benefits from period 9 onwards. So this was a big advantage for otherwise laid off employees. They could collect $500 on CERB or receive up to $847 of their wages as inactive employees. And by inactive, I mean not working, but still tied to their employer. I know some locals have letters of understanding that set the parameters of these inactive employees, and that's one of the main ways unions have been involved with the wage subsidy. Now the subsidy for inactive employees will be aligned with EI, so we're looking at a maximum of $573 a week per employee. Another important change is that employees who were unpaid for 14 days can now be included. That was a headache for some employers and made worse by some mixed messaging in the beginning when the CERB was announced prior to the wage subsidy. So that was a problem, but it's been fixed. And finally, I want to look ahead to 2021. In the fall economic statement, the government announced that it was going to raise the maximum subsidy rate back up to 75%. So far from winding down, the subsidy rate is expected to rise, though no legislation has been introduced yet. So here is a simple line chart that shows the total subsidy rate available at different points of revenue decline. And this is the total subsidy rate, so the base rate and the top-up combined. From periods 8 to 10, and yeah, this applies to periods 8 to 10. So the horizontal axis is revenue decline, and the vertical axis is the subsidy rate. At the far left, an employer with a 100% revenue decline can access the max subsidy of 65%. Companies with a 70% decline can also get the max subsidy rate of 70%. But if you have less than a 70% decline in revenue, then your top-up rate is decreasing. So you see like a different slope between 70% revenue decline and 50% revenue decline. And then if you have a less than 50% revenue decline, then the top-up is no longer available. So if your revenue only declined by 49%, you're looking at a total subsidy rate of about 40%. And that decreases as we move towards zero. And I present this only to make this point, is that subsidies are available even if companies don't hit a specific threshold. This is a feature that has changed to make the program more accessible, and there is money available for hard-hit and not so hard-hit companies. And they can apply for the subsidy for the first 5 periods until the end of January 2021. So now for who has already received the subsidy, I will turn that over to Gio.
Great, thanks, Matthew. So I just wanted to briefly discuss and share a few slides on the performance of the wage subsidy program, particularly in terms of its coverage of the Canadian labor force. So this particular slide provides a summary of the program up until November 22nd, 2020. And so far, over 1.6 million applications have been received by the program, with the vast majority of them having been accepted. These applications would include repeat employers using the program. Over 350 applications have been unique, and this basically means that over 350,000 different employers have applied to the program. And in total, so far, the program has paid out, I think, approximately $50 billion in subsidies. Originally back in March, when the government of Canada rolled out the program, or the end of March rather, it had budgeted about $80 billion or so for this program. So there's still a ways off that budgeted amount. The table on the right side of the slide shows how many workers were covered in each period of the wage subsidy program. And you can see that the highest was in period 3, which would have been June to July, I believe, where 3.9 million workers were receiving funds from the program. So while the program has seen a declining number in the past few periods, which is a good sign, obviously, you can see that the wage subsidy has been a key component in supporting the wages of a good chunk of the labor force. And we can see this impact a little bit better on the next slide. This slide contains the same data from the previous one, but in a graph form, with the addition of the share of the Canadian labor force that was covered by the wage subsidy program. So the blue line measures the total amount of workers that were covered under the program. And as I mentioned previously, in period 3, from May 10th to June 8th, 3.8 million workers were on the wage subsidy program. The red line measures the share of the labor force that was on the wage subsidy program. So at its height, again, in period 3, nearly 23% of the labor force were covered by the wage subsidy. Currently, it sits at about 9%. But I think this graph demonstrates just how important the program was in supporting workers' incomes, particularly in the earlier phases of the crisis. Next slide, please. If we look at the wage subsidy coverage by sector, we can get a better understanding of which sectors have used the program and how much subsidy monies they have accessed. So this pie chart breaks down the wage subsidy coverage by sector. And so 70% of all employees covered in the wage subsidy program were in the service sector, and 30% of all employees covered were in the goods producing sector. This pie chart's a little bit more interesting, and it breaks down the distribution of wage subsidy monies by sector. So 20% of all wage subsidy monies went to the manufacturing sector, which is approximately $9 billion. And this sector was by far the largest receiver of wage subsidy funds. Construction was also one of the highest receivers at 11%. Retail and trade and accommodation and food services, which you may have heard took some of the biggest employment hits out of all the sectors, received 8% each of all wage subsidy funds. While the chart also shows that a large chunk of wage subsidy funds has gone to the service sector, which again isn't necessarily surprising given the employment breakdown, what really stands out for me at least is of course the share that has gone to manufacturing. And so while the share of the funds would reflect in general, I think the higher wages that are earned in the sector was also one of the most consistently reliant out of all the sectors on the wage subsidy program, especially at the beginning of the crisis. And on the next slide, we'll get a better view of that. This line graph shows exactly how extensive the wage subsidy program was in terms of its coverage within the manufacturing sector. The red line at the bottom tracks the share of manufacturing workers within the wage subsidy program by itself. So along with accommodation and food services, which isn't shown on this particular graph, manufacturing represented the largest sector in terms of coverage within the program itself. So for example, in periods 3 and periods 4, 1 out of every 5 workers within the wage subsidy program was from the manufacturing sector. The blue line represents how many workers within the entire manufacturing sector in each period were covered by the wage subsidy program. And as you can see, especially in the early phases of the crisis, nearly 1 out of every 2 workers in the entire sector were covered by the program. At its height, in period 3, for example, over 700,000 manufacturing workers were covered by the wage subsidy program. This demonstrates, I think, quite clearly how important the program was for ensuring workers remain tied to their employers and therefore stabilizing employment levels in the manufacturing sector. And had it not been for the program, job losses would have been worse. So just to give you a little bit of a perspective, for example, from periods 1 to periods 2, which would have covered March 15th to about May 5th, the manufacturing sector lost 250,000 jobs. During the same period, almost 650,000 manufacturing workers went on the wage subsidy program or were covered by the program. It wouldn't be much of a stretch, I think, to assume that the job losses in those 2 periods in particular would have been substantially worse if not for the wage subsidy. Next slide. And so just to provide some concluding thoughts, I think the program, although underutilized, at least in terms of the expectations of the government, has been a key program in stabilizing the economic shock caused by COVID. I think we saw this through how extensive the program covered the labor force, particularly at the beginning of the crisis, and in particular in the manufacturing sector. It's been a key program in not only stabilizing employment levels, but also at the same time supporting wages and consumer demand. And at the end of the day, it's been an additional $50 billion spent by the government, which, because it was targeted at supporting workers' wages, they can be sure it will be spent in the economy. In addition to ensuring workers obviously did not lose their jobs and kept them tied to their employers. Another part I did want to mention, but which I didn't devote time to in the presentation, was that 2/3 of the recipients of the wage subsidy went to small and medium-sized employers. So that's employers with in between 0 to 25 employees and 25 to 250 workers. The vast majority of our employers would obviously fall under these 2 categories. And so the program has been crucial in ensuring employment and wage levels were maintained for those particular firm sizes and in that particular market. Back to you, Meg or Matthew.
I'll take over. Thank you so much, Gio and Matthew. So now we're going to move on to questions. So just to remind you, you can ask a question by using the Q&A function at the bottom or the chat function. And if you do prefer to ask a live question, you can indicate that and we can unmute you to ask the question. So far, we have one question that has come in. So I'll just start with that one. And I'll ask Matthew to get this started. So the question is the list of employers who applied and were approved for the wage subsidy a matter of public record? And if so, are we able to find specific companies? Many members allege their companies are receiving the CEWS and that benefit should trickle down to them. Matthew, you can start with that one.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. Short answer is no. Information's not about wage subsidy recipients is not published anywhere, not publicly accessible. In the original piece of legislation, the original plan, there is a provision that the minister, finance, I believe, can disclose the name of recipients, but that was intended in more of a name and shame mechanism. So for recipients of the wage subsidy who are not using it honestly, the government could name them. More recently this week, I've seen two pieces of investigative journalism come out, one from the CBC, one from the Financial Post, where they talk about their frustrations getting freedom of information requests from the government. So there's been resistance there. But also these journalists looked at the financial reports of publicly traded companies, and through that way has found out whether they've gotten the subsidy or not. So in short, no, it's not publicly available, though this is something we're concerned about and we've been asking about. But if the employers are publicly traded, they'll probably report it in their financial statements.
Okay, thanks for that. Okay, so we do have one live question. We'll go to that in a sec. I just wanted to follow up on the first question and then ask Gio to give some comments as well and relate this to collective bargaining. Is this something we should be asking for as we go into bargaining? What are the implications of all of this for bargaining?
Yeah, thanks, Meg. I think we should definitely be asking if we're going into bargaining, asking employers if they've been on the wage subsidy or if they're currently receiving funds from the wage subsidy or if they received funds from the wage subsidy at any point. I think that's something we should be doing for sure. In terms of like getting access, I think Matthew sort of covered those bases pretty well. I think there's also some other tools potentially that we could also use, like filing for freedom of information requests with the government. So I think we can do some stuff on that end, try to find out for sure, even if employers don't want to willingly tell us. But again, as Matthew said, they are sort of obligated by accounting standards to include that in their financial statements. And that was particularly the one way in which the recent journalistic pieces, investigative journalism, they found the Canadian publicly traded companies were accessing the wage subsidy program. But again, that depends on how it's reported, and there's a lot of creativity can be used in accounting practices to not properly itemize those sources of income. But yes, I mean, to answer your original question, yeah, we should definitely be asking our employers if they've been on the wage subsidy program, particularly if you're facing concessionary, potentially concessionary in bargaining.
Okay, thanks for that. So we're now going to go, I see Mark Ayotte has his hand raised. So we'll go to a live question. DJ, if you could unmute Mark and you can go ahead and ask your question. Okay, it's muted. Okay, I think you should be unmuted now, Mark.
I am, thanks, Meg. I think this question is from Mathieu. I might have missed the answer to it before, but we're in negotiations, or constant negotiation with gateway casinos, and they obviously use the CEWS. I just had a phone call with them last night, they're extending the benefits to January 31st for full-timers and part-timers, but the CEWS is only till December 19th because of the government delay. Do you, I know, Mathieu, you mentioned that they're probably going to increase the percentage to 75%, but have you heard anything about extending the December 19th to January 19th deadline or moving forward?
So the wage subsidy is already extended until June 2021, but we only know the rules for the periods until December 19, right? So there will be a subsidy until 2021, but how much that subsidy isn't super clear yet. So the government has been coming out with these rules for only the next few periods, making these adjustments on the fly, which on one hand is frustrating. On the other hand, I understand that they've made some necessary adjustments to the program. But yeah, so I think what the employer is saying there is they only know the rules until December 19th. But the program will continue afterwards. As far as going back up to 75%, that was announced in the fall economic statement, but there hasn't been legislation to bring it into effect yet.
Right. So I guess the thing was they're waiting. Well, they're on hold because of the government until they know specifically, and that's what we're telling the members. Until we hear specifically what the government's going to be doing, Gateway Casino will be following suit. Until then, we can't speed up the process. Yeah,
they could be hung up a bit on like revenue decline calculations. So the rules for that have changed a bit in every period. I didn't really go into that much in this presentation, but the rules have changed. So if they don't have a over 50% revenue decline, maybe they're waiting for different rules about how to determine how much the revenue declined and how much they could be eligible for. So I understand there that rules have not been published for December 19 onwards.
Thanks, Mathieu. Long time no speak, anyways.
Pas de problème, Marc.
Okay, thanks. So let's see. I'm going to ask one more question of Guillaume. Again, if anyone else wants to ask a live question, just raise your hand and we'll unmute you. So we've seen, like Matthew said, we saw some articles come out, investigative journalism, sort of focusing on large employers in particular who are still paying out dividends. And that brings me back to sort of the beginning when the steelworkers, like we made a bunch of demands about what should be attached and the conditions in terms of who should get the wage subsidy and how it can be used. A lot of those were not met, some were. But Guillaume, just in the end, overall, would you say that the wage subsidy has been a success? Even if we didn't get everything we pushed for, has it ultimately been good for workers?
Yeah. I mean, straightforwardly, yeah, I think it's been a success in its objective to, and the way the program was designed, so to sustain and stabilize employment. I think it did that, and I think some of the charts that we saw. I mean, at one point, the wage subsidy covered nearly 25% of the labor market, or the labor force rather, in the early phase of the crisis and the lockdowns, and nearly half of manufacturing. So I think it did play a role in slowing down job loss and sustaining and stabilizing employment. So on that end, I think it's done its job. I think we're still waiting for a little bit more data to have a much more sort of conclusive overall assessment of the program. But I think it's done its job on that aspect, particularly keeping workers tied to their employers. But yeah, I mean, on the other stuff, some of the conditions that we sort of thought were necessary for this program, it's kind of disappointing to see that they weren't included in the original design of the program, particularly the safeguards that we wanted to see around no payment of dividends. We also, suggested that no collective bargaining agreements should be opened up, no dramatic changes, et cetera, should be permitted. But yeah, it's very disappointing that the dividends, no dividend payouts wasn't included as the recent pieces in in the National Post sort of show that, you know, over $1 billion in dividends were paid out to 68 Canadian publicly traded companies for sure.
Right. Okay. So I don't see any other questions or anyone else with a hand raised. So if there aren't, I just want to let everybody know that we will be sending out a handout that summarizes a bunch of this material. And as in previous webinars, if you need to reach us in the research department, please go ahead. You can either contact us individually, or you can go through research@usw.ca, and there's more information at usw.ca/COVID-19. I'm just going to do one last check to see if there's any other last questions. So no, it doesn't look like there's any more questions. So with that, I'm just going to thank everyone who joined today, and special thanks to Matthew and Guillaume for all of your work on this. And to DJ behind the scenes, and to Adrian as well. So with that, we'll wrap up the webinar. Thanks, and bye for now.